Of course, the intensity of these earthquakes, though, vary geographically, but the response that the system has is in our control. Uh, can we design better systems? Can we incorporate risks that are posed by these hazards or these natural disasters? Of course, we can. Like natural hazards, we also have accidents in transport systems. I think one of the major risk factors of in any transport systems that is sort of part not only based on natural disasters but mostly driven by human errors is road accidents. Now, speeding and aggressive driving incidences increase accident risks and they also compromise infrastructure safety. So, just to give you an example, uh, a major road accident on any of the major highways would not only cause, I mean, would of course would cause harm to life and property, but it also leads to blocking of the infrastructure. Now, consider a scenario where a major accident has caused blockage on the road. Now, what does it lead to? It leads to risk of life, injury. It also leads to blockage of traffic. Now, imagine a, an ambulance is moving across the road. Now, the risk associated with this accident does not confine only to the people who were involved in the accident. A person who is coming or an ambulance coming probably is taking another patient to the hospital. Now, due to this blockage, the person in the ambulance is also is susceptible to the accident risk. So what happens in general that we look at risk from in a very small zone, rather risks should be considered holistic. So accident risks do involve not only uh, a very uh, a very microscopic view, but it should include a very holistic view as well. So, as I was mentioning, it involves loss of life. It also leads to a lot of monetary repercussions. So, statistics say that 1.35 million people die annually in road accidents. 1.35 million people is probably the population of one of the largest cities in the UK. Now, so essentially, we are using these large cities just because of accidents annually. That is a heartening statistic. Beyond these fatalities, we also see losses from in terms of 3 to 22 billion globally. Now, just to put these numbers in context, this probably amounts to GDP of an average country, probably in Africa. So essentially, just because of road accidents, we are losing not just monetary losses, but also human lives. So it just highlights the importance of assessing risk, incorporating it in planning so that these losses can be avoided. Now, how do we incorporate risk? In very plain terms or in very naive understanding, risk is essentially we take risks every day, but the mental calculation of risk varies. So if we are crossing the road, we do take risk of crossing the road because there is a very small chance that we might be hit by a oncoming vehicle. But how do we know that we are safe? So we assess the risk mentally, and then when we see that the system is safe, we decide to cross the road. How do we calculate risk? So risk assessment, one of the most important part of risk assessment is calculating risk. And in order to calculate risk, we must know what essentially forms part of the risk. So risk constitutes of three main parts. Uh, First part is identification of hazard. So I'll just move on. Okay, wait. Yeah. So risk essentially constitutes of three parts. One is hazard. The next is the severity of the hazard. And the third is consequence of the hazard. So these are the three broad things that we will be discussing in this presentation. Uh, identification of hazard, the severity of the hazard, and the consequence of the hazard. Now, these look very simple, but in order to come up with a numerical definition for each of these three domains, we have to understand how each of these parts can be calculated and how they influence the human systems and the transport infrastructure in general. Now, I was talking about holistic risk management, where we not only combine how we view the risk from an accident to accident, but rather view at it at a systemic level. In addition to that, we must also combine the human behavioral interventions that are associated with risk mitigation. So, just to give you an example, we have red lights at zebra crossings where people are supposed to stop. And of course, we have traffic violations or fines if someone violates these rules. How do we know people won't violate these rules? Of course, we impose fines on them. But how much fine is should be imposed on people so that it deters them from violating these traffic rules? So these are some of the questions that we want to understand, of course, analytically and with data, so that it can help us impose these fines or create enforcement strategies where people are deterred from violating these rules. So, a major part of risk identification is also risk mitigation, and risk mitigation involves enforcing certain rules and strategies so that people follow them and thus thereby minimizing risk. In order to do so, of course, it requires money. Nothing that we do, any infrastructure requires a lot of money. Some countries are very rich. Of course, not all countries have that privilege. India, of course, we are growing at one of the fastest rates globally, but we have to realize that we have a lot of mouths to feed. A growing population, which is one of the major, most important assets to us, also means that our per capita resource is constrained. Therefore, when we use resources, we must always consider that resource should be used optimally and its use should be very effective in trying to achieve the target that we want to achieve. So essentially, these are the three topics that I would sort of discuss. And when I discuss these, I'll try to connect it with some of the research that I have been involved in the past. So I'll start with risk assessment framework, which essentially explain what is risk, how can it support planning decisions effectively, what it includes, can you calculate it, and then as case studies, I'll try to explain some of the research that I had been involved in, where we undertook assessment of risk, particularly in case of accident severity. In another stream of research that I was involved in, we looked at the behavioral interventions to design better enforcement strategies to avoid speeding. With these two research, I'll try to sort of pave the way for discussion where we can then come up with efficient strategies or discuss how these research outputs can better inform the implementation and government agencies in deriving policies that not mitigate risks. Finally, I'll conclude the presentation with floor open for discussion. So risk assessment frameworks. So as I mentioned, risk essentially constitutes of three parts. The first and the most important part is hazard. So what is a hazard? So any hazard, natural, man-made, or it could be a human error-enforced hazard, is essentially something that happens that triggers an incident which poses risk to not just the system but the users of the system. So in order to understand or assess the risk, we first must understand what is the likelihood that a hazard will occur. So of course, we can only predict hazards. and we predict hazards based on our learnings from the past data. So just to give you an example, we consider the probability of an earthquake happening based on the past earthquakes that we have experienced. Similarly, in traffic engineering, we predict the occurrence of accidents, or we isolate zones that are more likely to have see accidents based on the past accidents reportings. So, in any infrastructure or in transport infrastructure, a natural hazard would mean probably a flood, an earthquake, a landslide. In very generic sense, or in our day-to-day life, since we don't experience them daily, road traffic accident is also a hazard. So essentially, the first part of assessing risk is calculating the probability of that hazard occurring. The next bit is the severity of the hazard. So when we say severity, there are different levels of severity. A simple brush up on the road is also an accident. Although the severity of that accident was low, does it mean it does not hold value? No, it does. Similarly, a small earthquake, which may not have caused much catastrophe, is still an accident. Of course, its severity was low, but what happens when such low severity accidents keep on happening? It does increase risk. So the risk not only is characterized by the severity, but also by the frequency. So the frequency part is taken care of by the hazard probability, and the severity of the hazard is characterized by the severity assessment. The third part is vulnerability. So we know that an accident or a hazard can pose risk. The severity of the hazard increases or decreases the risk. Now, who is at risk? That is governed by the vulnerability analysis. So, let's say in landslides, literature has indicated that landslides are more catastrophic to women and children. They pose a higher risk because of a lot of biological reasons, that such events are more susceptible to women and children. So, in order to better plan, and one of the artifacts of this you would have seen is separate queues for women and children than in men. So, this is risk planning seeing practical implementation. Since we know that women and children are more vulnerable, we have decided to have sort of separate queues. Now, this is something, so it's important to also analyze the vulnerability of a hazard. So, with these three factors, essentially form the risk. So, each of these factors then would have to be understood in not just in isolation, but as a part of a system. So, hazard identification is it's sort of straightforward. It looks straightforward, but entails a lot of analysis. So, looking at a segment of road, uh, any road segment can pose a hazard, but there are different levels of hazards that are posed by different road segments. Now, some road segments pose greater hazard or greater risk of accidents. On the other hand, some road segments do not pose as greater a risk. This is governed by a lot of factors that we will discuss in this next set of slides. Um, so once the hazard is identified, we move on to assessment of risk for that segment. So if we analyze and evaluate the likelihood of impact of identified hazard based on the existing geographical and situational conditions. So an example is, what are the chances of an accident happening given the road profile? What would be the severity of that accident? So how do we use these? In the example of road accidents, we have different speed limits. So these speed limits are informed by the risk that are posed by that road segments. So we sort of, our work as risk assessors is to understand what level of risks are posed by these road segments, and based on that risk, we come up with the speed limits. Uh, Finally, the third part of risk assessment includes risk treatment strategies. So essentially, once we have identified risks, we try to mitigate these risks. One way of mitigation, as I was discussing, is imposing speed limits. Another strategy to mitigate risk is imposing fines for, say, or imposing fine for violating speed limit. So imposing speed limit alone would not uh, mitigate risk. Some people would have to follow, and since humans are involved, there is of course human decision making, which is heterogeneous. Some people are more likely to follow rules. Some people are rebel; they don't want to follow rules. So there have to be systems in place that make them follow rules, and these strategies, of course, we live in a democracy, so we can impose certain rules. And then if you violate these rules, there are repercussions. So these fines are then driven by the humans involved in the decision making. So as road users, we cannot impose fines which are very high, because literature has identified that very high fines sort of impair the marginal populations more, and the richer population or the non-marginal population sorts of gets away with these fines. So even identifying the appropriate fines requires risks not only risk assessment, but also behavioral interventions that are involved in these decisions. So the framework overall includes, once we have identified risk, we try to avoid risk. That's the first step. So we design strategies that help us avoid these risks. The second part is endurance. So once we know that there is a risk involved, we understand that there is a non-zero chance that an hazard will occur, and it will have its consequences. So we design systems considering these consequences, and we hope that the systems that are designed can endure these consequences. The third bit is recovery. So once the system can endure these consequences, the system has to go back to its to at least to its functioning capacity. And that also depends on how well the systems that we design are in fact in place, and and also how these systems are implemented. So the designing these systems is just one part of the puzzle. The next part, the second part of the puzzle, is of course implementation, and that's where I think the academia and this industry synergy, which is the core of this topic, is very important, because most of the times academics work in silos and then do not inform um, the practitioners or the implementators of these world. So these have to work together, and that's where these synergies between academics and uh, practitioners and uh, industry folks is very important. And the fourth part of the risk assessment framework is adaptability. So what does it mean by adaptability? So of course, the risk that we model now would probably be useful in, say, in a very short term future. But the systems that we are seeing currently are more dynamic in nature. So just to give you an example, 10 years ago, we wouldn't have thought that AI would pose risk that it currently poses. And of course, there were people at the helm of things who thought that, yes, these AI systems would pose that risk. And one of the examples is added securities on devices that we use. There are two factors authentications that we use in most of our devices. And that considers the risks and and that actually envisages the adaptability of these systems based on the risks that are posed. Another simple example that you would have thought that you would have seen on a day-to-day basis is when you enter any website, you would have been asked to put CAPTCHA. It seems very silly why these CAPTCHAs aren't in place, but if you really go into the technology behind it, these are very useful, at least in our day-to-day systems that we tackle. Of course, for very sophisticated systems, these CAPTCHAs are not as important, but for accessing information that we do as normal residents, these CAPTCHA do help in averting a lot of harmful things that AI can pose on general surfing. So with this background, I will sort of move into some of the research and try to give you an example of how risk assessment can be done in transport planning. I will use two research themes or research works that I was involved in. The first one being analyzing or the injury severity in crashes. Now, this directly informs the risk assessment, the three parts that I've discussed on risk assessment, which is hazard identification, severity analysis, and vulnerability analysis. The second part the second topic that I'll be discussing is evaluation risk mitigation strategies. So essentially, which strategies can help better and effective implementation of systems so that people follow them, adhere them, and do not violate them as often. So this work, I was actively involved, and both of these works are unfortunately not from India. The first work uses data from the US, and the second work uses data from Hong Kong. I'll talk more about the details of each of these in the next slides. So the analytical assessment of risk, I'll start with injury severity analysis. So as a part of this work, so this work was done by one of my co-authors who I have had the privilege of working in close quarters. We have worked on a lot of papers together. So this work essentially tries to understand how can injury profiling be done in accidents, and based on these injury profiling, uh, it helps in assessing the risk associated with crashes based on what kind of injuries can crashes lead to. What are the factors that influence the severity of the injury, and what can be done to mitigate um, these factors so that the severity of the injuries can be reduced and the risk can be controlled. So, as I discussed, risk in accident crashes involved frequency of crashes, severity of crashes. So, the accident risk would involve the likelihood of a crash happening and the consequence of the crash, which is the vulnerability multiplied by the severity. In the prevalent literature, so this research was motivated by the fact that in prevalent literature, the severity of the crashes was typically driver-centric. So most of the work that had been done in the past, people used to assess risk only based on the driver or single occupancy vehicles. Now this ignores the risk that is posed by the other occupants, and again and leads to looking at risk from a very microscopic lens, only driver centric, which essentially downplays the risk that is associated in these crashes. So in this study, the risk assessment is done considering all the occupants of all the vehicles involved in the crash. So this was a neat framework that was proposed, and the data for this work was taken by the National Highway Traffic Safety Authority from the US. It included crash data from around 15,000 crashes that involved around 23 odd thousand vehicles and 34,000 occupants. So just to bring it to context of the discussion, uh, assessment of risk requires data. Of course, we can have opinion, and certain opinions are, of course, logical. But in order to put a number, or in order to understand and incorporate risk in our planning decisions, we need to have a mathematical framework that sort of assess risks. And in order to have a mathematical framework or to bring models into action, we need data. So one of the most important bits that is often missing when I look at some of the things or some of the issues uh, prevailing is the lack of data. A lot of our implementation is done based on opinion, of course, expert opinions, but expert opinion is a lot of time overrated. Let the data speak for itself. That's my 2 cents. So of course, once the data is available, we can assess risk better. So yeah, don't get bogged down by these equations. I just put them just to highlight that the sophisticated nature of the work that goes behind the simple probability or the severity analysis of accident. But if you look at the background of these equations, it's not as complicated as it looks. I can send you the link of the paper, and you guys can happily refer that paper. And if you have any questions, feel free to write to me. So essentially, what we did is we had the crash data. We had the characterizations of the ordinal outcomes that were involved in characterizing the severity of the injury. So as you can see in the pie chart, the classification was no injury, possible injury, minor injury, and serious injury. Now, of course, this is US data. There were also, I believe, a very small fraction of fatal injuries. But again, the fraction I think was around 0.7 or 0.8%. And if a fraction is that small, it's very difficult to characterize the factors that influence the likelihood of fatal injuries. So that's where data, as you uh, add data from years and as more data comes in, possibly it'd be useful to sort of also understand the factors involved in fatal injuries. But for the sake of this study, I think the fatal injuries were removed from the analysis. Now, considering the ordinal nature of these injuries, we sort of used a modified rank ordered framework, which at the core of it considers that these injury outcomes are ordinal in nature. And when I say ordinal in nature, it means that there is an inherent ordering among these injuries. So of course, so the ordinal nature comes from the severity of the injury. So if the severity increases as we go along, no injury to possible injury to minor injury and to a severe injury. So it's important to keep intact the ordinal nature of the severity outcomes. It helps us understand the factors that influences the outcome of these injuries better. As to formulate the model, we used explanators that included occupant characteristics, and not just driver characteristics. So we used a multivariate model where the severity of the injury in a joint across all the occupants were analyzed in a joint framework. We used the demographic variables, including age, gender, seating position, seat belt, and alcohol consumption, if involved, to any of the occupants. Incidentally, though alcohol consumption is banned for drivers, it's a violation. Still, we do see drivers consuming alcohol, and they cause accidents. And as we will see, alcohol consumption is one of the largest cause of severe injuries. We also included vehicle characteristics, which included vehicle type, make, model, year. And of course, this is an important determinant of the severity of the injury. So if you look at the safety ratings of these vehicles, you will see certain vehicles are ranked higher than others. That is also informed by such analysis, where the analysis of these accidents, of course, these companies, when they do their experiments, they do it in a controlled setting. But we could also find that certain vehicle makes and models were more safe in a very similar accident situation than others, thus highlighting that safety. So if any of you are going to buy a car or buying a vehicle, do look at the safety ratings of the vehicles, because it does make a difference. In addition to the vehicle characteristics, we also included situational characteristics. So just to give you an example, what was the speed limit on the road? Was the person driving above or under the speed limit? What was the profile of the roadway? What was the curve and grade of the road? How many lanes were involved? And also, what were the traffic conditions? So with all this setup, the things that, or the model outcome that we are interested in, the severity of the injuries. But just to connect it with the risk assessment framework, the hazard here is the accident on a road segment. Who are the who is this hazard being exposed to? It's the vehicle occupants. Of course, one thing that is missing in this is the other passengers or the other travelers on the road. And of course, you can include the exposure to these other travelers, but we did not have the data of who these other travelers were. And that's where I think, and if you think practically about it, when an accident happens, mostly the information that is collected is of the people that are involved in the accident. But it goes beyond just the occupants. It also includes other people who were traveling but just missed or were not involved. So if you are trying to assess risk, you must include these other travelers who were traveling in the vicinity at the time of the accident. So that's where active data collection through police reports may not suffice in these conditions, because you would not know, because they were not part of the accident themselves. But in passive data collection using imaging or videos, you can actually get information on who these travelers were. So I'll discuss some of the future directions, that how the dynamic nature of the data can help better assess risks. So, for the sake of this study, the exposure was constrained to the occupants of the vehicles that were involved in the crash. Now, the vulnerability. Now, so in this model, we sort of allowed the vulnerability to vary across different occupants. So, usually, what happens when a vehicle is involved in a crash, we typically assume that all the occupants of the vehicles have the same vulnerability. In this framework, we allowed the vulnerability to vary across the occupants. Now, the consequence is the relative ordering of severity. This is the outcome that we are trying to model and how this helps assess risk. So essentially, we are able to put a likelihood of persons involved in the crash to the severity of their injury. And using this probability of, or the likelihood of injury severity, we can sort of uh, prioritize or formulate how much risk does each of these accident uh, amount to. So high risk accidents or high injury severity accidents can, so if we identify that certain sections are leading to high likelihood of severe injuries, probably we need some mitigation there, some additional mitigation. So that's how risk assessment helps planning. So what were the key findings of our work? So high risk group that were identified in our work were mostly seniors. They had the highest probability of severe injuries. Young adults, elevated risks for children, and then females. They have higher injury susceptibility. Of course, we were also able to, in this study, I think The study uses a mixed model where the parameters were allowed to be heterogeneous across population, and it uses a mixing distribution. So essentially, this heterogeneity also showed, this susceptibility also showed heterogeneity across population. So now, based on these high risk groups, what are the planning insights? So basically, now we know that risk is demographically structured. So policies, if you only form policies that say, oh, this kind of accident poses this risks, is not enough. So one of the policy insights that you would see that essentially I think we also need in India is the rule of toddler seats in vehicles. Currently, it's not mandatory in India, at least as far as I know, and I could be wrong. And please correct me if I'm wrong. We do using toddler seats for kids is not mandatory, but in most Western countries, it's a traffic violation if you don't put toddlers on toddler seats in cars. So, because they do understand that toddlers are at a higher risk, so that's why they impose toddler seats in these cars just to avoid severe injuries to toddlers. So, this is actually academic research facilitating planning in fruition. So, that's what we aim for. That's what academic research is all about. Another finding from this work was the use of seat belt. I mean, this is not the first time, but again, it just enforces the previous findings as well that seat belt use is the largest determinant of non-seat belt use is the largest determinant of severe injury in accidents. It causes ejection, and which is catastrophically severe. It increases the severity quite high, and it applies uniformly to all occupants. It is not just for the drivers. So in India, I believe that only people who are sitting in the front seats are, I mean, I think the rule says that everyone should wear seat belts, but in practice, what people do is they only the driver and the co and person in the co-driver seat wears the seat belt. But actually, it should be mandated that I think it's mandated, but it's about enforcing the mandate, and that would be my next study that I'll talk about. That and just having systems alone may not be enough. Implementation should also allow enforcement of these mandates. And how do you enforce these mandates? Again, involves human decision, human behavior. So it's sort of yeah, it's a tricky thing because we live in a democratic society, so we cannot make rules left, right, and center, but these violations need to have some sort of fines or reparations or some sort of remedial measures where people who do not follow have to pay certain violations in order for these systems to work effectively. So the policy translation of the seatbelt use is that enforcement and compliance yield disproportionate risk reduction. So basically, enforcement and compliance. So this is the gap that I was talking about. That enforcing a law and its compliance yield so it so if you just enforce the law because safe seat belts are enforced, but its compliance leads to a disproportionate risk reduction. So having a law that says that seat belts must be worn reduces the risk, but its compliance actually reduces the risk a lot more than just having its enforcement. So basically, what the study posed is that enforcement must be automated, and this is now being done in most cars. So if you look at most of the recent Tesla features, if you do not if you do not put the seat belt on, there is a system in place where the car won't start, and these kind of enforcement strategies are important. Um, so this is again academic work seeing its implications in fruition. And I think the study also makes a point of behavioral interventions needed to comply for these enforcement in a better way. I'll talk about these in more detail in the next work that I'll be discussing. Some other policy insights that this work talks about is risk-informed prioritization. So essentially, if we are trying to assess risk, usually we assess risk for the accidents, disregarding that each occupant involved in the crash poses different risks. Now, if you are carrying children, you pose different risk as compared to if you're just two adults in the car, or if you are carrying someone, if the car is carrying elderlies, it poses different risks than just carrying adults. So these heterogeneity in the risk profiles must be considered when we try to assess risks. So we also talk about, I think the study also talks about equity and vulnerability mapping, where the severity of the crash varies with demographic, road geometry, and speed environment. So, and based on these, I think the study identifies who bears the most burden and under which profile. So, one of the key policy insights was about enforcement as risk mitigation. So seatbelt use, of course, alcohol involvement and speed management, these are all enforced. These are all violations, but their enforcement and their compliance are two different things. Again, if we look at the risk, so seatbelt, so I mentioned that seatbelt enforcement is mandatory, but its systemic severity is not considered. And that's why only drivers and co-passengers wear seatbelts, but not other occupants of the vehicle. In this study, it's mentioned clearly that even if the non-driving occupants of the vehicle do not wear seatbelts, it the severity of the accident increases many folds. So we make it a point that risk should not only be seen as marginal risk. And by marginal risk, I mean reduction in severity of the accident just looking at the person who's driving the car. That's a very marginal viewpoint that we reduce risk if the driver is wearing the seatbelt. On the other hand, if you look at the systemic risk, where you incorporate the risk posed by all the occupants, you do see that looking at risk in a systemic fashion rather than just looking at marginal risk can lead to better risk mitigation strategies. So this was one work. By the way, I'm happy to take any questions because these are two different set pieces of work. So in case there are any questions, I don't know how it works. Anisa, do they raise hands or do you want to take questions at the end? Hello?
So, sir, we will having a question answer session at the end of the
At the
session.
end. Okay, perfect. All right. Okay. All right, then I'll talk about the next bit of the research, which is on evaluation on enforcement strategies to curb rash driving. So one of the important determinant of severity was uh, uh, violating speed limits. And despite having enforcements of speed violations, people do speed. And I mean, it's global. It's not geographic specific. It's across the world. People do, and probably more in Western world due to reasons of better infrastructure. People do speed a lot more as compared to India, and that's one of the reasons I think we do not see more fatal crashes in India as compared to the Western world. But with our infrastructure also developing, I think it's imminent that we will start seeing more fatal or more severe crashes. And that's where I think we need to learn and just go beyond enforcement and also look into compliance to mitigate risk. And so I'll talk about this work. In this work, I was actively involved. This basically what we were trying to understand uh, how enforcing or what kind of strategies would help people not violate, not actually not have speed violations. So just to give you some background, Hong Kong, the geography of the study is in Hong Kong, where the public transport drivers or most of the car and bus drivers are actually very compliant. So the traffic violations by cars and public transport drivers are actually one of the lowest in the world. However, a key, an important, and interesting thing that we looked into was how the professional drivers, so essentially the drivers of these logistic companies, drivers of people or drive Amazon drivers, for instance. I mean, we did not focus on any specific company, but just to give you an example, how these D2 B2C logistic partners, the drivers who facilitate these deliveries, they tend to violate a lot. And I'm not sure if this is true in India, but if I'm remembering correctly, I think I read a report where a lot of our in Indian B2C logistic companies were also violating traffic rules a lot as well. So, though the context of the study is in Hong Kong, I think the findings are equally relevant for India as well. Of course, we need to have this analysis, similar analysis done in India, just to see what kind of behavioral nudges work better for our population, because people are different. I have realized that across geography, of course, some traits remain the same, but some traits do change. So these geographical heterogeneity must be accounted for. And but just to bring it into context, I'll just give a view of the analysis that we did and how it sort of informs better enforcement strategies. So the study included a survey of professional drivers. We did a stated preference survey with 400 professional drivers. And if you have questions on how a stated preference survey is conducted, just feel free to write to me and I'll give you the details of what essentially it entails. So essentially, we asked these drivers, so we vary certain, so these traffic violations typically involve paying a fine or having a demerit point on your license. Uh, so how do these traffic fines, how do people respond to these traffic fines? And how do people respond to these demerit points on their license? Are they still, at what points are people not willing to violate traffic rules anymore or speeding rules anymore? Is fine alone a sufficient measure, or should we use fine and DOP in combinations? Are speed cameras needed? Uh, should speed cameras be installed everywhere? Is there an optimal use of speed cameras, which utilizes the resources better? As in, speed cameras are costly. We cannot have every segment of road filled with speed cameras, and I mean, it also sorts of violates our privacy as well. Too many cameras means you are being looked at. Of course, not. Of course, the cameras only estimate the speed violations, but in a democratic society, too many cameras can be seen as a problematic thing. So, and of course, in order to save money, do we need cameras everywhere, or is there a better strategy that we can use? So, in this work, we sort of created these hypothetical scenarios and we surveyed professional drivers. So basically, this was a scenario-based exercise where we participants select response to different enforcement strategies using the stated preference survey. The enforcement strategies included increasing demerit points, which is called DOP, raising fines, adding more cameras, and adjusting warning sign distances. So essentially, whenever the speed limit changes, there is a warning sign. What's the optimal distance of that warning sign that must be placed? So all these were the experiment environment. We wanted to see how people or these drivers responded to these attributes of the road segment. So essentially, we also wanted to see how people traded off. So are people willing to pay slightly more if they only violate, say, by 10 kilometers per hour? Of course, a violation is a violation, but how much are people willing to pay? Or what should be the optimal fine so that people don't violate that often? So these were the kind of trade-offs that we wanted to see in our work. So we undertook this stated preference experiment, and we collected information from 400 odd um, these professional drivers, and our data that was then collated, and and we estimated a simple econometric choice model with heterogeneous parameters. I'm not going to go into the models, but if you guys are interested, I can share the paper uh, with you. Just feel free to write to me over email. So the findings that we saw in through this work is that DOP, if you just give a demerit point, one demerit point increases the compliance or reduces the violation by 4%. Now, this looks very small. Similarly, monetary fines, even a 10% increase in monetary fines only yields a 1.7% compliance. So essentially, these two results together told us that if you just give them DOP points or demerit points, people are not going to comply. And if you just give monetary fines, people are not going to comply. And in addition to and increasing monetary fines, the more you start increasing monetary fines, the more it's likely that it's going to hurt the marginalized population more, because rich people can't pay their fines and just be on with it. So essentially, what in our sensitivity analysis, we saw that the combination of these two are the most effective strategy to enforce or to comply enforcement. So we also and essentially what this DOP, the demerit points, mean is once you accumulate enough number of demerit points, you get your license suspended for 6 months or 1 year. So this threat of suspension of license was the strongest deterrent. So it also depends how many points the person has accumulated. So the closer it was to suspension, the more compliant the driver was. So, I mean, these are all logical insights, but in order to have a mathematical model and the data speak for it, gives us more confidence that yes, fines alone may not help. Demerit points and fines together can help comply better and help mitigate risks more. So the other piece of the enforcement strategies that we looked at was effective camera enforcement. So I was talking about how cameras be everywhere. So an interesting bit about this specific work was that in Hong Kong they have camera housing units. So cameras are not applied directly. Cameras are put in a red orange box, and the orange box is visible from a larger distance. So the idea of keeping an orange box is just that it's different from red, so that people don't mistake it for a warning sign. And the orange box, people do understand that it may have a camera. But the interesting bit here was that not every camera box had a camera. So if the only mandate from a policy or from a government standpoint was that the information on camera to housing or camera to box has to be made public. So if let's say you want a 20% camera to box ratio, that means for every 100 boxes, 20 of them would have a camera installed. And you let people know that one in every 5 boxes have a camera, but they don't know which box has a camera in it. So essentially, you are putting boxes. Now only one of them, one out of every 5 box has a camera, but the deterrence it had is that people think that they didn't know which one had a camera. So essentially, the impact it had was larger than we had anticipated. So camera to housing, as you increase the camera to housing ratio, of course, the compliance increased. But what we saw was that not all boxes need to have camera. I think it was this was 7 years ago, so probably I might not be 100% correct, but it was around I think 60% where we saw that it saturates and the compliance is just uniform after that. So at 60% of camera to housing ratio, we saw that the compliance is the maximum. So this again means that we can install boxes and not every box needs to have camera. And of course, boxes are much cheaper than cameras. So we are optimally using our resources as well. Of course, in public interest, we do, or the stakeholders do mention how many cameras are there in the boxes, but they do not tell which box has the camera. So this is one optimal and smart use of resource that I saw in this work. In the context of optimal sign placement, we found something interesting that if you let people know well in advance that there is a camera, speeding camera, people sort of, if it was more than 50 meters, people still speed. And if it's optimally placed near 33 or 30 meter, if I'm not wrong, I think it was zero point 0.6 of the optimal maximum distance. That's where the warning signs actually had the most the most efficient use, where people, when they saw the warning signs just say 30 meters before the camera, they were deterred the most. Keeping the warning signs well in advance actually saw a sort of a kangaroo effect, where people thought, oh, the camera is way far ahead, so they can still speed. So the speed and slow behavior was seen when cameras were placed at a larger distance. Uh, so we also saw that people who were driving and who were receiving remunerations for each trip that they were more likely to speed. Younger individuals were more likely to speed, and recent ticket, someone who has got a ticket in the recent past was also most likely to speed despite the penalties. So probably people who receive tickets more frequently are repeat offenders, and that's where I think stronger compliance measures such as cancellation of licenses can work in curbing these speed violations. These are some of the marginal effects from the study. We changed the camera to housing ratio, and increasing the camera to housing ratio reduced the speeding by 50%. So essentially, camera to housing does help in deterring speeding, but only up to a certain extent, and that's where the optimal utilization of cameras can be looked into. Effect of warning sign placements that I just discussed, and cost-effective policy decisions, including optimizing camera placement and warning signs, which I've just discussed. So from this study, the major outcomes and the policy implications was how can we combine engineering, enforcement, and education is crucial for effective risk reduction. So essentially, just imposing fines may not be sufficient. We need to think of measures and efficient strategies that can help curb speeding fines. And how does this form risk? So basically, this is all risk mitigation. In the previous work, we understood that speeding is one of the strongest determinant of injury severity. So speeding does pose risk. Now, what can we do to mitigate that risk? Have efficient strategies so that people do not speed. That involves having the things that I just discussed in place so that people avoid speeding. And that's where a combination of fines, demerit points on the license suspensions at the extreme ends, having cameras, and not having cameras everywhere, but having cameras in boxes, and having an optimal number of camera to box ratio can help achieve results that we are going after. And of course, there could be targeted interventions to high-risk groups such as strip riders, people who receive their incentives for every trip that they take rather than salaried professionals. So these are some of the policy level recommendations that needs to be implemented, and that's where the stakeholders, the government stakeholders, the policymakers come into picture. So as I've said, academics typically they give you data driven recommendations, and it's the industry and the policymakers and the stakeholders to enforce those recommendations, and that's where the synergies lie, and hopefully uh, we will see more of that happening in the future. So yeah, these are some of the behavioral risk integration, how our work in general can incorporate behavioral risks that goes beyond just engineering and systems design. So incorporating behavioral risk is important because at the end of the day, the users of these systems are humans, and humans behave differently. Everyone is different. Everyone has their own risk appetite. Everyone behaves to these nudges differently. So it's important to incorporate human behavior when we design systems and when we assess risks. Now, of course, these applications are from different geographic contexts, but the underlying theme lies is globally applicable. And yes, that being said, we should not take the findings directly. We need to collect more data from our own geographic context, see how we can sort of redefine or reshape the experiments and come up with our own strategies that work better in our case. Of course, deterrence and enforcement also have different geographical contexts. So different countries may have different rules, may have different policies. So the enforcement has to be according to those rules. And of course, if enforcement needs shows that certain rules needs redefining, we should be open for that as well. With this, I'll just discuss the challenges and the future directions. Now, I think if there are researchers at the helm in the audience, they will understand when I say data scarcity. There is a lot of data, but is it available for research? Is there enough transparency? These are the questions that I think we need to ask ourselves. And in what form is the data available? What can we do to make more of such collaborative efforts in data? So if someone collects data in one part of the country, should that data be made available to other people? Of course, there are checks and balances in place. So these are not straightforward questions, but one of the key challenges that most of us in the room would agree is that data is a resource. We don't get data that we need. We have to work with the data that we have. So that is one challenge that we need to overcome. Having said that, the technological developments have made it much easier now. So the use of video analytics. So in one of the studies that I was mentioning, where we did not have information on other on travelers who were not involved in the accidents, that could be made available if the video data of the crash is made available. So that goes beyond just relying on police reports of the accident. So that's where more data is available. Of course, getting insights or getting that data into useful form is a challenge. But with AI-driven technologies, video analytics that is available at the helm, that is no way far-fetched. That's relatively easier now, and most of us should be able to use these resources or use this technology to our advantage. So yeah, that's one of the future directions that we can take. Of course, real-time monitoring systems needs to be in place. So for video data to be useful, there must be a video data. So we need some cameras or some sort of data collection strategies in place. That doesn't mean that we put cameras everywhere. Of course, there are certain identification of sections that need some sort of supervision, must have certain cameras there. And once we know more, how is the traffic or how is a traveler behaving at these junctions, and analyzing that data can help infer or assess risk better. So, and finally, this is a collaborative platform. I don't think one person or one research domain alone can solve the problem. Infrastructure at the end of the day is an infrastructure because it encompasses a lot of things. So I looked at it from a standpoint of transport planning. Of course, I didn't even talk about how roads affect or how roads behave or these materials behave under different geographic, under different weather conditions. Now that's a stream open for materials engineering folks, chemical engineering folks, and physical systems. So, I mean, it's a multi-collaborative effort that is needed to better assess risk. And with this, I'll just close the presentation with this neat uh, image that I had found a few days ago when I was just working on something else, where we work on so our research area is typically a small dent in larger scheme of things. So we have to contextualize our research with the larger systems. And this presentation sort of helped me do that. And hopefully I was able to convey to the audience as well. But if we are working in a specific field, we should strive to make the bigger picture clear. We should put our work in the context of the overarching goal, and that's where I think the most impact of the research lies, because we work in silos and when we create outputs that are understandable, of course, and useful for our own field, but how they impact the larger system is where I think the real impact happens. With that, I'll close the presentation and open the floor for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the very informative session. I request the participants, if they have any questions, please be free to ask. Any questions? Hopefully no questions, I think so.
Okay, if there are no questions, yeah, let them, if you have a list of questions even later, let me know. And if anyone needs links to the paper, I think there are a lot of link. I don't know what these links means, but if you have any requests for paper links, I'm happy to share those paper links as well.
Okay, thank you, sir.
No problem. Thank you.
I express my heartfelt gratitude to our distinguished resource person, Dr. Shobhit Saxena, sir, for delivering insightful session today. His explanation on the resilience framework and its core connection to the FDP topic has provided us with a clear direction on how resilience can be effectively implemented in practice. He has rightly emphasized that successful implementation requires collective effort, collaboration, and working together as a system, which aligns perfectly with the objective of this FDP. His emphasis on risk assessment, identifying potential challenges in advance, and adopting appropriate mitigation strategies have given participants a practical roadmap to build resilient system and institution. Thank you very much, sir, for giving us your time, valuable time. I really thank you because on messages only we were communicating and you have given us the time. Thank you
I
very
know.
much.
And sorry, Anisa, I know. So when I know Sangram must have
Yes.
given my recommendation, and I wasn't sure what I'll speak on hazard mapping because I have no background on it. But
Yeah,
this
yeah.
actually gave me a good perspective as well. So thank you. And sorry for the mess because we are finishing our session in our university. We are just finishing the semester. So it's kind of a lot of work right now, and the time difference of course doesn't help because I know I was earlier in a morning session, which would have meant me getting up at 4:30 and I wouldn't have been active then. So yeah, sorry for all the miscommunication and
Yes,
the
sir,
email slacks.
your session was very much fruitful for us, sir. Thank you very much, sir. With
All
this,
right.
we conclude today's session. We kindly request all the participants to fill in the feedback form shared with you. Tomorrow's session will begin at 11 sharp. We look forward to your continued participation. Thank you.